What if I told you you could take a make automation and turn it into an n8n template in seconds? In this video, I'll show you exactly how you can do that. If you're looking for an easy way to migrate between make.com and n8n, this solution is not just going to be faster, but it's going to open the doors for thousands of new automation templates that you can start using to master n8n as soon as possible. I'm going to first walk through how this process works at a high level, and then we'll jump into a tool that I put together that you can use to turn not just one automation, but multiple automations into n8n templates in minutes. And then I'll finish off the video by going through when you might want to consider using make.com or n8n, depending on your specific use case. If that sounds like a plan, stick with me and let's dive right in. So in my last video, I mentioned how workflow automation tools like make.com and n8n are powered by something called JSON. So the automations you see on screen behind the scenes are a series of syntaxed code that basically translate that code into the bubbles or the nodes that you see on your actual automations. And if you don't believe me, we can take a look at this demo little sample here in make.com. So you can see here we have three different modules in this scenario where we have one that gets some form of input, we have a GPT step, and we have something that pastes and creates a new row in Google Sheets. This, if we download it by clicking on here and clicking on export blueprint, we'll get the JSON file. And if you double click this entire thing, if you were to zoom in just a tad, will be the exact representation of what you see on screen, but from a JSON perspective. So all this code represents everything you see here on screen. Now the reason why you can't just download this JSON file and upload it into n8n directly is that the way that they're structured and tagged is very different. Make.com has over thousands of integrations that aren't necessarily interchangeable with n8n, so you have to translate from one JSON to the next by referring to things like documentation, examples, etc. But as the lazy mad scientist I am, I didn't want to settle for having to do that, so I built an automation in make.com that lets you just drag and drop a series of JSON files and have them converted immediately. So if we go to this tab here, you're going to see I have this semi-complex automation, and if we dive into the details here, you're going to see that we have our first step here, which is a Google Drive step. You could sub this out for a OneDrive, a Dropbox, anything where you can basically watch files come in. And what we're doing is we're listening in for any file that's a JSON file in our folder that's called make JSON converter. And in this case, I'm setting the limit of number of files that it can load at once to 10. You can make this 20, you can make this 30, depending on how many operations you have in your make.com account, but we'll just click save here, and that's the very first step. Now the next step is to actually download the file that we watched in the folder, and what has to happen is typically make.com will download a file in what's called binary. So it's a series of numbers that aren't actually the JSON that's in the actual folder. So what we have to do is take that variable that we received, which is data, and basically encode it in a way that we put it back into that JSON format I showed you at the start of the video. And once we have that sorted, that's when we can get into these three modules, which make up the mad scientist part of this actual automation. So if we look into the details here, we have Perplexity, which is basically a search engine that has an API that lets us also search the internet when we're not connected to the actual product. So in this case, if we choose the model called Sonar Pro, it is a stronger model that does a decent amount of research that will allow us to go and look at things like the n8n docs, examples of automations, so we can quickly check how to translate one JSON, the make.com, to the new JSON, which you want to import into our n8n workspace. Now, in terms of the actual prompt, don't worry about screenshotting this or taking notes. This whole automation and the underlying prompt will be available to you in the description below, so just sit back and just observe. If we take a closer look, I say you are an expert in workflow automations and conversion between platforms. Here's a make.com automation blueprint with the JSON provided as an input, and in this case I'm just referencing this variable test, and you see it popping out on the left hand side of the screen. And then I say your task is to research the latest documentation and templates for both make.com and n8n, propose a detailed JSON sample that converts the make.com workflow into the equivalent n8n workflow. This is important because knowing that there are thousands of integrations in Make that don't exist yet in n8n, if there isn't a match, we don't want it to just break the JSON. Ideally, we should have some form of substitute, or we should try to have some form of placeholder that could act as a substitute. The next part I listed here is for each module in the make.com and JSON, map it to the closest matching n8n node and indicate how you handle differences in structure, data mapping, and unsupported features. So that's this component here is very important to make sure we don't get broken JSONs if there isn't a direct match. Now, if we keep going, we say if a direct one-to-one conversion isn't possible, suggest a workaround or augmentation using n8n's available nodes. So again, go look at the n8n documentation and try and learn how you can adapt. And then the final one is output your response strictly as a JSON sample that demonstrates the conversion with appropriate variable references. In this case, I'm saying node names like module 1, module 2, so it's easy to see that actual label when we go into n8n. So after this one's done, one thing that I really like to do is add one more node of similar structure to try to check the work of the initial output. Sometimes even with smarter models or smarter reasoning models, the first time it does something, there's some extra metadata, there are some hiccups that pop up. So in this prompt here, I basically tell it to validate the JSON it came up with in the first one, go and research again to double check that it's using the correct syntax, the latest version of syntax for n8n, and then to go down here, there are some issues that pop up sometimes in importing into n8n, and the fourth step here says, ensure no property name issues will arise from the amended JSON. This property name issue pops up sometimes when you import into n8n. Basically, imagine you have a JSON here, and for some reason it's missing a label. So n8n doesn't know what to do with it, how to label it, or what it actually should represent. So in this case, I call this out here, and then I basically say return the refined JSON if there is one. And once this part's done, we get to the most pivotal stage, which is this GPT stage where I add a reasoning model, specifically O3, and I'll tell you why I'm choosing that specific model. It's not only less expensive and pretty performant for a smaller reasoning model, but it has a very large context window. And that matters a lot because if you have more complex make automations, let's say 15, 20, 30 different nodes long, that JSON file becomes thousands of lines of syntax that you have to convert pretty much. So when you have a larger context window for not only input, but output, O3 has up to 100,000 token output. So in this case, at the very bottom here, it's by default 2048. You want to change that to something a lot bigger depending on your circumstance. But I noticed that it's the perfect level of one, being able to thoughtfully check that you have a valid JSON structure, check that it's probably in the best structure for n8n, and most importantly, it can actually spit it back out. Whereas if you use something like Anthropic or Claude 3.5 Sonnet, it's actually really good at doing this conversion, but it has a fixed cutoff window for how many tokens it can output. So you might get a JSON file that is quote unquote correct, but it won't be complete, meaning it won't be valid and you won't be able to import it into n8n. From a prompting perspective, if we go up in here, you'll see that we say identify any syntax errors, check that all the node connections, parameter fields, and variable references conform to valid n8n JSON structure, and then provide a corrected version if there are errors, and then return only the corrected JSON and nothing else. And one thing I added here is don't add inline comments. OpenAI loves doing that with code, where it tries to comment what it changed and why. If you have comments, it will not import properly into n8n. And the last part is basically don't explain what you did. As most LLMs do, they try to brag about how smart they were in fixing things. We don't want any of that. So this part will take care of this portion. And then we have two more steps here where we want to parse that JSON that we get from OpenAI. And this acts as a failsafe. If even this stage hallucinated and we got some comments in this JSON and it doesn't work, this stage will make sure the automation stops because it's not a valid JSON and we know it won't import into n8n. So we probably have to rerun, or you could also think about adding one more O3 mini step, assuming you're not processing millions of these or hundreds of thousands of these, that you can double check the syntax of the prior step. So you can do a chain prompt to double check the syntax from the last O3. And the final steps we have here is we want to transform that JSON we parsed and double checked, and then we want to throw that into this Google Drive step where we put it back into the same folder, but this time we convert it to a JSON file, because right now all we have, if you think about it, is a bunch of JSON, but it's not in an actual file format that we can consume and use. So we basically do this whole replace name JSON, and we call it edited_JSON, just to make sure that we know what's the difference between the original automation from make and the one that we can now import into n8n. And in terms of the actual JSON, this data part is where we're pulling out that parse JSON right here that you can see. And this is exactly what we need to do to actually write it back to our Google Drive. So let's actually run this in action and process not one, but 3 files at once. So if we go into the folder here, we'll see it's blank. And what we're going to do is I'm going to go into my folder and then upload 3 different automations. One of them has an integration that for sure doesn't exist in n8n, so you'll see how that actually behaves. So we'll drag and drop this to the folder, and then once it's uploaded, we're going to go to the automation here. We'll click back out, and then I'm going to run once, and you'll see it's going to load 1 file at a time and process 1 file at a time. Now the parts that will take longer here is the perplexity steps, because it's using the Sonar Pro, so it is being a lot more thoughtful about this research. So while this is processing that last step, you'll see here that from the second perplexity step, we received an actual output here. And if we go into content, you'll see that we're receiving a JSON with nothing else. So far so good. This looks like it should be a proper output. This part will take a little bit longer just to double check, but as soon as this runs, we'll know immediately if the JSON is valid. If this passes this step, then we should be good. And it looks like we are good for that first one. And if we go into the Google Drive folder, you'll see here we have this first Cleo automation edited, which is the one that should work in n8n. So I'll just wait for the next 2 to run, and then we'll try to import all 3 into n8n. Now it finished running, and luckily we can see that all 3 of the actual bundles or the files have been successfully converted. So before we actually put these into n8n, it's helpful to see the before and after. So in this case, we have the first automation, which says Cleo automation. Cleo is a tool that tons of lawyers use. So this is an automation that would go listen in for any changes needed, and then go and update their Cleo management system for documents, and then update an Airtable to say what changed, and then notify them by Slack. In this case, I know for a fact that Cleo does not exist in n8n as an integration. So one thing I'll see here is, one, do we copy paste something that's functional and makes sense, and is it a valid JSON? And does it know that we have to swap out or substitute something in lieu of that? So in this case, as a shortcut, I'll click on the file itself. I'll do Command A, Command C, and I can just do copy paste directly into n8n. And you'll see here that it knows that Cleo obviously is non-functional. It's not an actual valid node, but the rest of it has a very close semblance for what we started with. So what's helpful here is when you do these conversions, you also learn what n8n can or can't do, and where you might have to step in with what's called an HTTP request, where you make a custom request to an API because it's not a native integration in the tool itself yet. So if we look at the remaining ones, we have another one, which is a pretty straightforward perplexity step here, where we have perplexity, a couple different tool variables, and then we talk to OpenAI. And in this case, if we go back to the file and go back to perplexity automation edited, I'll just do Command C, and then we'll do Command V, and then pretty much we have like for like nodes here. So perplexity, it's smart enough to know that we have to do an HTTP request to the API. So if you double click on this node, it's smart enough to inherit the completions, and all we'd have to do is enter our credentials to make that call. And then it has a like for like swap between the set tool and the set variable. So this works as well. And then we have the OpenAI step in make.com, which has a transferable one directly in n8n. So this is a pretty clean swap. And for the last one, we have a social media content planner here, where we have a Google Sheet node that leads to a draft of a blog, and then we have some key points and then some variables set, and then we have a router that either goes to an iterator or to writing to a Google Sheet. In this case, if we take that JSON here, let's go into social media content, copy this, paste it into our last brand new workspace here, and you'll see this one's also pretty good at the like for like comparison. It was smart enough to add a text aggregator node from n8n because there's no like for like on iterator or aggregator exactly from make.com. And then the rest of it seems to be intact. We even have the router from make.com, which is right here, if we just zoom in a tad. And for this last part here, it seems to have this one intact as well. One thing I noticed is we didn't inherit this iterator step for this Google file. So this is one thing we might want to add, but in general, it's a solid head start on being able to do that migration. And again, we did some learning to know, hey, you know what? In here, a text aggregator looks like this node versus what we're used to in make.com, which looks very similar to this one here. So with that being said, if we go back to our original automation, this worked for, I'd say 90% of the automations I gave to it. Obviously, you're going to have situations where maybe you have 30, 50, 70 different nodes, and you could have some JSON parsing issues. To resolve those, I'd look at two main things. The first is your JSON not valid because it's cutting off, because it's way too big of an output? If so, you might want to go back to this GPT step using 03 and make this max completion 20,000, 30,000. You should be able to go up to right below 100,000 and have it output. Now, it might be pricier if you're running this for tons of automations with 70, 50 nodes, but for smaller ones, this should be pretty comprehensive and work at least 80 to 90% of the time. But again, not perfect. And for the second part is if it's working from an output side, but you're still having some parsing errors, you could add a few other perplexity steps. You could add another 03 step to do double checking on that syntax and fix things. But overall, this should be malleable enough of an automation that you can manipulate to get to the dream outcome you're looking for and convert whatever you need from make to n8n. Now, like I promised, I wanted to talk about when you'd consider make.com and n8n depending on your use case, your business, and what you do day to day. If I go to this other tab I have here, just to show you, we have a make.com gallery full of thousands of automations. And not only are there thousands of them, but if you're completely brand new to automation and you click on something like try it, it will literally hold your hand to tell you where to put variables, how to put those variables, and overall it's more of a playful UI to show you step by step how these automations work. So if you are a beginner or intermediate and you're looking to just focus on learning what's happening in the tech itself, and the automations you're running are affecting maybe tens of people or max a couple hundred people, make.com might be a good alternative if you're not running tons of operations. The key difference between n8n and make.com on operations is if you go back to our automation here, let's say 10 different nodes, every single time I run this automation, I'm using my allowance of operations that you're giving in make.com. So if we have 1,000, every single time I rip through this, I'm taking 10 every single time. And if I have multiple files, I'm now running more and more operations. Once you get to scales of tens of thousands of operations per month or hundreds of thousands, that's where you see your make.com bill skyrocket. And that's where n8n has a huge advantage, because in n8n, you could have 50 nodes, 100 nodes, but when you run your automation, it's considered as one operation. So the cost benefit at scale is a huge difference. The next thing is if you have a very bespoke workflows where you need to add some custom code, or you need to be able to configure these nodes and modules very easily and robustly, n8n is also a better advantage for that. And the last key difference is n8n is open source. So it has a very strong community, constantly developing new nodes, new ways of actually making it more efficient, and pretty much all of its documentation is open on GitHub. Whereas make.com is closed source, which is why doing this conversion from make to n8n is possible through this research, because everything's out in the open. Whereas if you try to do this exact workflow, which I tried, to go from n8n to make, you struggle a lot because there's no open documentation for make.com that's as open as n8n, which makes things more difficult because not all the documentation or templates are up to date on the actual website itself, the same way it is on the n8n community. So overall, the TLDR is if you're a beginner or you're running tens of operations or low hundreds of operations per week, I would typically stick to a make.com until you feel comfortable enough and you have that learning curve of understanding concepts like iterators, aggregators, webhooks. And once you have that down, if you see a huge cost benefit or a productivity benefit by doing some custom things in n8n, that's where I think you get to graduate and use that once you have a firm foundation on how these workflow automation tools work in general. Now, once again, the automation you see here that we went through is going to be available for you in the Gumroad link in the description below. If you want to support the channel for more mad scientist experiments, I'd love you for it. If not, all good. And if you are a business owner and content like this really resonates with you and helps you, maybe consider applying to join our Early AI Adopters community in the second link in the description below, and maybe I'll see you there. Enjoy, and I'll see you next time.